Hi, I'm Jaroslaw Anders, a literary critic and translator in my free time, let's put it this way. Welcome to another meeting in our series, Travelers of the Word, in which we try to present Polish poetry and Polish poems as a part of international literary environment, something that can be appreciated, read also outside the specific Polish context. We ask international readers to share with us and discuss their favorite Polish poems.
And I'm Małgorzata Pośpiech, assistant professor at the Polish program at Hunter College. And in this series, we try to present Polish poetry. We want to trace of the Polish poetic world to see how it resonates and with people of other cultures and backgrounds.
And our today's guest is Dr. Boris Dralyuk, a professor of literature and creative writing at the University of Tulsa in Oklahoma. Hello, Boris.
Hello,
Boris
thank you
is
for
also
having me.
an editor, a translator, and also a poet. He's the author of a book of poetry titled My Hollywood, and I hope that we'll have time to talk about this book a little too.
So now let's turn to our guest. Welcome, Boris. What Polish poem would you like to read to share with our audience and with us?
Well, I would like to share a poem, a sonnet by Leopold, who was a very significant figure in Polish poetry, not just at the time of his greatest popularity or at the as a member of his own generation, the young Poland generation, but really an influence for several generations of Polish poets whose style continued to change and evolve through the 20th century. The poem I would like to share is to my mind, one of the sweetest of his poems, and he did have a very sweet sensibility by the looks of it. And I'll read it in my translation. It's called Childhood. The poetry of ancient wells, of broken clocks, the attic, cracked mute violins without a fiddler, a yellow book where dried forget-me-nots still sleep, were to my childhood an enchanted woodland. First I collected rusty keys. A tale whispered that one key was a wondrous gift of gifts which opened castles hidden in a mist, where I would go, pale prince out of Van Dyke oil. Then I collected butterflies, a magic lamp's charmed marvels that appeared upon a papered wall, and also for a long time postage stamps. For they were like a crazy journey round the world, full of departures to the earth's four corners, sweet dreams, ridiculous, like happiness, like happiness.
That's a very beautiful poem, of course. Very interesting choice. Leopold was born in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century. He was, as you mentioned, very influential, very important in Polish letters during the interwar decades. He continued writing after the war until, early 50s. He died in 1957. Not particularly well known in the United States, as far as I know. Not much translated as well. So what attracted you to Leopold?
Well, I have to thank, and this is a figure whom you probably both know, Roman Koropecki, my longtime professor at UCLA, a great specialist, a great in Polish literature, a biographer of Mickiewicz, and a very dedicated teacher of Polish literature, even when his students numbered one. So for quite some time, I took an independent studies course as a graduate student at UCLA, an independent studies course with Roman. Sometimes we were joined by another student. At times it was just myself and him. And he took me through the entire history as deeply as he could of Polish literature, and we often paused on less well-known figures. And Staff was one of those figures. when reading through some of the more famous works associated with the kind of decadent national revival, the great liberating modernist movement of young Poland, I saw a number of programmatic works, a lot of poets who were very much of their time, or seemed to me to be of their time. What made Staff stand out for me is first of all how little Poland there was in some of these poems. In some ways, they were more international in spirit and kind of more universal in their concerns. And especially this sonnet, which I think to which anyone can relate, regardless of their youthful hobbies and regardless of the exact circumstances of their youth. I think he renders with such a delicate touch, almost like the painter Van Dyck, renders with such a delicate touch and such vividness the charms of childhood, that regardless of where you are, regardless of who you are, you can tap right into that feeling.
Early poems, I think, was written in 1905, something like that, when he wasn't even 30, I think, at that time.
Yes.
And there is this nostalgia, this grieving over lost world of childhood, still the whole life ahead of him.
Yes.
A long life and very productive, but he's already grieving in a sense. As you mentioned, he transformed his political idiom quite substantially over the years. As far as I remember, in my youth, when I started being interested in poetry around, in high school probably, and with a group of people likewise disposed towards poetry, we thought about stuff as somehow old-fashioned already, somehow, too delicate. You use the word delicate, too classical, too subdued. We wanted something stronger. We were the generation who was reading Różewicz, and others, something, with a punch. But now when we think about stuff, he's probably much more complicated than it seemed to us at that time, and there is a lot of anxiety in his poems, because as a young man he was influenced by Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, but this anxiety is always mitigated. It's kind of disguised by this very smooth and very calm classical form. So there is this two things kind of fighting together, in a sense. And in some poems, one goes up, and the other
Yes.
shows something very interesting when you look at him as a kind of in a historical perspective.
Yes, and I think that what you say is very much what Miłosz tried to bring across in his discussion of Staff and in his history of Polish literature, the kind of dialectic between Nietzsche and Saint Francis. He was translating both at the same time. And he did describe him as a kind of Renaissance figure, and there is a great deal of harmony to the outer presentation of the poems. And yet what underlies them is, as you say, an anxiety about modernity, an anxiety about passing time. Like most great poets, he was elegizing before the loss happened, like you say, he was mourning loss before actually experiencing it. So, and that aligns him with, a number of international figures like, T.S. Eliot, who was just 10 years later writing I grow old in his early 20s. And so this is he is a modern figure, despite this calm classical exterior. And of course, the generation that directly followed him also adopted this ideal of clarity and classicism. The Scamander generation, and for them he was a great role model in this regard.
Yes, and his poems written. I mean, I know that Miłosz praised, have been considered him very highly, and he translated some of Staff's poems and included them in the anthology Post-War Polish Poetry. After the war, his idiom has changed a lot, and there is one poem translated by Miłosz. If you do allow me to read it, it's a very short poem. If you don't mind, it's called Foundations. I built on the sand, and it tumbled down. I built on a rock, and it tumbled down. Now, when I build, I shall begin with the smoke from the chimney. So this is, it could have been written by Szymborska, this epigram with an ironic twist at the end, even by someone, like later generation, like Ryszard Krynicki, for instance.
Yes.
He was very, very, it's not that he was trying to adapt, but he actually followed the sensitivity of the time.
He was very much in tune with that sensibility, and it's remarkable to think of his age at the time that he was writing these things. This was not a young man. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let me.
Yeah, if I may. So it is also beautiful translation, Boris. So could you
Yes.
tell us what is your process of translation?
Sure, of
Polish?
course.
Mhm.
I mean, it differs. It differs in every case. Each poem demands its own method. But my general sense is that I let the poem gestate for quite some time, without writing anything or even actively, consciously thinking of possibilities for the translation. And then by the time the poem is ready, it tells me, and I sit down, and it comes out almost without effort. I mean, of course, there is a great deal of effort, but it's such a fun effort that it doesn't feel effortful. And in the case of most of my translations are in some way formal, so they correspond to the metrical rules of
Mhm.
English, or metrical traditions of Anglophone poetry. And I'm quite lucky in this case, because I'm working in this sonnet with an international form that also corresponds to those international strictures. But the fact that the Polish doesn't have a fixed metrical structure here allows me to loosen the lines so that it's not a monotonous pentameter. It has a greater rhythm, more rhythmic rather than metrical structure.
Yes, the Slavic syllabotonic poetry is beautiful, but it makes it also very difficult to translate, to find the equivalent in, say, Germanic languages, English and so on. You translate mostly, I noticed, mostly from the Russian, sometimes from Polish, right?
Sometimes from Polish, sometimes from Ukrainian, and increasingly, and mostly I've been translating from Russian. It's the tradition I know best, and the tradition that I feel I have a greater sensitivity to, Russophone poetry.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I developed a deep love for a number of Polish poets, and both in the Russophone and in the Polish tradition, I'm drawn to the lesser known, less recognized, less well translated, less studied poets. I feel that my heart is always with the underdogs.
Who else? Who else in Polish literature and Polish poetry?
Well, my it's interesting because if you look at my blog, there aren't that many offerings, but the Scamander group is very important to me. And one poem that I could, if you'd like, if 1 second, I'll find it for you.
Yes.
Um, uh, One poem that I would like to share. Uh, and this is an example of a translation where I abandoned the rather strict form of the original. This is Maria Pawlikowska, Jasnorzewska, and she was a member of the kind of the Scamander group, and lived part of her life in immigration, but had a great deal of wit, and she reminded me so much of some of my favorite Anglophone poets of her time, like Edna St. Vincent Millay, and even a little bit of Dorothy Parker. And this is a poem very similar in spirit to the one I've just shared by Staff, in which, in this case, she looks forward to a future in which she's the grandmother, or her generation is the generation of grandmothers who are regaling their children with stories of their youth. It's called Granny, and it's from 1924, just 20 years after Staff's poem. 50 years hence, she'll sit down at the piano. That very spring she'll turn 74. A granny who wore jumpers, lived through the great and oh so dreary war, saw trams glide through the streets, the airplane take its first steps in the sky, and people speaking without seeing one another over the telephone. The granny who recalls Krakus and Wanda, or who, in any case, recalls Foch and Pilsudski, who was intoxicated by a jazz band and who received her letters from the postman, whose youth passed shabbily without a Kiki Mobile, a biophone, a virocycle, or an astrodactyl. Watching her faded flicker with a wistful smile will play old-fashioned foxtrots on the piano. And what I love is that she actually envisions the invention of the iPhone with all of these
We can talk
neologisms.
Yes, see, yes, it's another great poet that is what was somehow in my generation neglected. She was considered a feminine poet, a poet of love. Yes, she wrote a lot about love, but she wrote about it in a very interesting, from the very interesting perspective. And I, for instance, I mean, not only I, the other critics also noticed that she is a predecessor of Szymborska in many ways.
Mhm.
There are many elements in her that were later developed by Szymborska. So congratulations on
Thank you.
choosing this.
Well, that sense of humor, you see, that sense of
Yeah.
humor that Szymborska has, it's there in this poem, and that wonderful childlike imagination, but treated with such maturity
Yeah.
at the level of craft.
Yeah. Well, you are a poet yourself, and you published a book, I think it was a couple of years ago, a book of poetry called My Hollywood. Would you read us something from the book and tell us why Hollywood?
Oh, yes. Well, there's a very simple explanation for the Hollywood component, and that's simply that I was raised in Hollywood. My family immigrated in 1991, right before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we came directly to Los Angeles with a brief layover in at JFK. But JFK didn't make much of an impression, except for all of the candy bars that could be bought. And Once I was in LA, I had a rich and complicated process of assimilation and grew to love the city very, very much. But I was also, to some extent, I felt culturally bereft and separated and alienated, even though there were many, many fellow emigres around me. I searched for a community of a literary community, of an artistic community, and I ended up finding it in history. I had a lot of friends who were interested in poetry, but I wanted to belong to a tradition, and I found my little tradition, which was the tradition of Hollywood past, the emigres who had remade the city. From the early part of the 20th century to what it is today. And Los Angeles is a town of immigrants, so everyone who comes through it has her or his own Hollywood, and this was my version, my little tradition of Hollywood immigration. So I don't know if I can find the perfect poem to communicate all of that, but let me see if I can just stumble on. Well, why not? Since we have time,
Mhm.
um, I'll read a poem in three parts, which is the title poem. It's called My Hollywood, and I think it'll explain to you my feelings about the place pretty well. Uh, it's a triptych, and it's set in three locations that are linked to one another. The first poem it describes a tiny park not far from where I worked for many years, where I would take my lunch and enjoy it in virtual solitude, except for the presence of two statues, and both of them were to the now almost forgotten Rudolph Valentino, the great star of silent cinema, romantic idol. One is a very abstract statue of him like a rocket looking up into space, and the other one is a very detailed sculpture, a bust of Valentino that was put up by his fans who were insulted by the abstract statue, which did not reflect his true human beauty. So this is the first poem. This much is clear. The good old days have passed. Some giant fig trees, a few pygmy palms, drop broken shade on disenfranchised grass. Dogs loping, limping, vagrants begging alms, and in the center, ludicrously named Aspiration, face uplifted, framed by dusty fronds, he stands on tippy-toe, abstract Adonis, bronze Lothario. Sit here all day if you can bear the grime, watch people come and go, but you will see no women in black shed tears for Valentino. The chic sinks deep into the dunes of time. A crow clacks in the branches overhead, like a projector slowly going dead. And what I'll do is I'll actually skip to the third poem in this triptych so as not to bore you. And this one
No problem.
concerns a hotel that no longer stands called the Gard Navala. The Gard Navala was built by an emigre, a Jewish actress from the Russian Empire, Alla Nazimova. The name was a pun, Gard Navala, of course, spelled as the deity, but very much her own passionate landscape. And before it was a hotel, it was her private home. And when it was built, there was really nothing around it. It was heaven on earth, surrounded by bean fields. Eventually, because of some bad choices she made, she had to sell it off, and it did become a hotel. And she became a resident in one of the rooms, one of the bungalows. And then the hotel was raised, and now it's like most things in Los Angeles, a strip mall. And I connect this to my own childhood in Los Angeles. And now I watch another era fade. Cyrillic letters scraped from shuttered storefronts, tar-crusted bread, stale fish, stiff marmalade sit sulking on the shelves. Unchosen orphans in what were once the bustling little shops of Russian Hollywood. Hardly a soul now stops to thumb the plums, frown at the penciled prices. The neighborhood is lurching towards crisis, all in slow motion. Rents climb out of reach for emigres. There's nothing new in this. Think of Nazimova and of her short-lived bliss beside her pool, her private Black Sea beach. She died a tenant in a bungalow of a hotel raised 60 years ago.
Beautiful. That I didn't know that you grew up in Hollywood, but we have to remember that the movie Hollywood, the American factory of dreams, was created by East Europeans, by people from the then Russian Empire, from Poland, Jews mostly, but
Not only, yeah.
not only. Valentino appeared in some films, I remember, with a beautiful actress called Pola Negri.
Yes, Polish, of
Her
course.
real
Yeah.
name was Filomena Chałupiec. She was a Polish girl. I mean, at the times of the silent movie, it was, you had beautiful face and you could act with your body, and that was all that was required. You didn't have to speak. So the beautiful poem, and also nostalgic, and also a lot of nostalgia.
And I noticed just now reading these things after reading this stuff, which I hadn't read in a long time,
Yeah.
the extent to which, and this is something that I notice all the time, my translations rhyme or echo my own poems and feed them. And here I noticed the first poem begins with a nice catalog, very much like Staff's begins with a catalog of things no longer here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we see. I'm sure that Małgorzata will confirm it. We see certain connection with this kind of gentle nostalgia. The kind of smooth goodbye. The things that.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe.
Thank you, Jarek. That'll be the
young
name of my next collection, Smooth Goodbye. I think it's perfect. The
So
Smooth Goodbye.
Well, we could talk for a long time, but I guess we try to.
We found another poem, The Broken Clock, which will be great conclusion of our conversation, because the topic is also childhood, nostalgia, passing time. So could you read it for us?
I would be very happy to. This is this is a more recent poem of mine, and it occurred to me that the old idiom about the broken clock being right twice a day is actually quite wrong, because a broken clock always points to the past. So, the broken clock. Past time maintains the broken clock. It isn't off, not by a minute. Without a tick, without a talk, past time maintains the broken clock. Twice every day, those still hands mock the present, but they're never in it. Past time maintains the broken clock. It isn't off, not by a minute.
Thank you so much. Very beautiful, the atmosphere of all those poems, your poems and staff poems and Pawlikowska, Jasnorzewska, the nostalgia and this sadness of passing time and how we dealing with it. Thank you so much, Boris. It's lovely to talk about poetry and listen to your poetry and your translations. Great. So, Jarek.
It was a real pleasure, and thank you very much for being with us and spending some time with us. And thank you for our listeners for also being with us. All the best with all your endeavors, and until the next time.
Thank you very, very much. Dziękuję bardzo.